The US military finds themselves backed into a corner in the Middle East once again. Surprise, surprise. Now, there's one faction that seems to stick out from the rest who is able to make a threat, able to actually attack the US military, and completely get away with it. They know nothing will happen to them, no harm will come their way. They are known as the Houthis, who fight out of Yemen. Now, just so you are aware, the Houthis are actually named the Ansarhallah, but I'm going to refer to them as the Houthis because that's what they're really known as, and that's how the media always calls them. Okay, so since the beginning of the war in Israel, the United States has been receiving attacks nearly daily, sometimes 4 times a day. Since the beginning of the war in Israel, the number is estimated to be around 80 to 90 attacks between bases in Syria and Iraq. However, the factions performing these attacks up in Syria and Iraq, they are distinct away from the Houthis. These guys are known as the Islamic resistance in Iraq. Now, the reason why these guys are relevant compared to the Houthis all the way down in Yemen is because the US military has taken steps to either fortify their bases or to actually go on the offensive, literally using AC-130J Ghost Riders to take out these rebel groups and factions who keep attacking the US military in Iraq and Syria. Now, what's interesting about the Houthis, their mortal enemy is of course Israel, but since the US military, the United States has decided to become partners with Israel and to back Israel and defend Israel, this automatically means, well, the Houthis are enemies to the United States and we're pretty much at war now. And look, I am aware the Houthis in the United States and Saudi Arabia, there's already been an ongoing conflict, but we're going to just talk about what's happening today and the context of why the Houthis seem to be trying to provoke a fight with the US military and again getting away with it. Now, one thing you need to remember is that Joe Biden himself actually warned and told the US military, prepare for an all-out conflict, prepare for a worst-case scenario in the Middle East. Now, what Joe Biden was referring to without saying it out loud was prepare just in case Iran decides to get into the war with Israel, but uses the US military as a crutch, starts to attack the US military directly from Iran, like an actual professional war, a professional military. And of course, because of this, since the US military was directly ordered from the top dog, Joe Biden, the US military has been fortifying their naval assets, air assets, ground assets. Pretty much everything has a change of posture and is prepared to be on the offensive in case something does actually pop off in the Middle East. But as far as the Houthis are concerned, this is quite a dilemma for the US military, so let me explain. One thing you need to understand is that the Houthis are quite literally trying to reach Israel with drones and with rocket attacks, again, all the way from Yemen. And you need to know this, the Houthis literally have the capability to do this, but the probability of them actually reaching Israel is extremely low. One of the major reasons for this, and the US Navy has proven this, is the US military has vowed to protect Israel from outside attacks. And this means the US Navy, who's patrolling the waters in the Red Sea, they are watching the Houthis, and the US Navy, they are doing their job. The US Navy has already squashed drone attacks, rocket attacks, again, launched from Yemen, launched from the Houthis, and of course, this really annoyed the Houthis. Now, here's where things get interesting. We already know the US military has a massive surveillance program around the world, with drones and a lot of assets that are quite literally watching all enemies of the United States, to include the Houthis. However, I think the US military made a massive miscalculation where the Houthis actually spotted an MQ-9 Reaper drone and took it out of the sky. Now, would this be means to a war or means to retaliation? Absolutely not, because the Russians did the exact same things to the US military, if not in a more embarrassing fashion, dumping fuel on a drone and then knocking it out of the sky. So in no way, shape, or form would the US military ever go to conflict with a faction like the Houthis over taking out a drone. That is quite literally the purpose of a drone, to get taken out of the sky. There's no one in the drone, so there's no reason to go to war over technology. However, here's where things escalate, and here's why I say the US military again is pinned into a corner. Understand this, the Houthis have threatened Israel to go after cargo ships and to go after all Israeli logistics in the sea. And so we're seeing actual successful missions of the Houthis launching drones, hitting a ship, actually seizing a ship, but then one attack was squashed, where the US Navy quite literally found the Houthis dead in their tracks, and there was a distress call made by an Israeli tanker where the US Navy showed up and managed to stop 5 attackers from conquering or taking over this ship. Now here's where things get spicy. Not too long after, more rocket attacks were launched in the direction of where this operation occurred, towards a naval ship. And just in case you were wondering, the ship is known as the USS Mason. Now look, let's be honest with ourselves. The US military has been extremely tolerant in the Middle East, and there's a reason for that. Joe Biden quite literally said we are not going to be the aggressors. But almost never in military history has the US military been attacked by rockets, and the US military did nothing about it. Now here's what the biggest underlying issue is for the US military. As we know, ultimately the government tells the US military what to do, and there's really one thing stopping the US military from actually retaliating or going after the Houthis. That is the non-designation of a terror group on the Houthis. Let me explain. Remember I sort of mentioned the whole US military, Saudi Arabia are kind of at war with the Houthis or trying to suppress them from attacking Saudi elements? Well, there's also a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. In fact, let me read this direct statement from Antony J. Blinken, Secretary of State, and this sort of gives you an idea of why the US military's hands are tied behind their back and why they're pinned into a corner. Effective February 16th, I am revoking the designations of the Ansar Allah, sometimes referred to as the Houthis, as a foreign terror organization under the Immigration and Nationality Act and as a specially designated global terror group. This decision is a recognition of the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen. We have listened to warnings from the UN, humanitarian groups, and bipartisan members of Congress, among others, that the designations could have a devastating impact on the Yemenis' access to basic commodities like food and fuel. The revocations and intended to ensure that the relevant US policies do not impede assistance to those already suffering what has been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. By focusing on alleviating the humanitarian situation in Yemen, we hope that the Yemeni parties can also focus on engaging in dialogue. Now, this almost sounds like what is happening to the Israeli Defense Forces, where they are just simply wanting to engage Hamas in their war, but the people who are truly suffering are, of course, the Palestinian civilians. And even if Israel does whatever it takes to avoid civilian casualties and trying to help with humanitarian aid, it simply just is not enough. And that is why, at the time of making this video, there is still a ceasefire, and the US government and other entities have put a lot of pressure on Israel to focus on the humanitarian aid. Do you think that's what the US military wants, is to be on humanitarian aid missions as they are trying to attack the Houthis? So again, this statement from Antony J. Blinken really solidifies why the US military will most likely never ever strike the Houthis. You already have the Yemeni people who are struggling with a massive humanitarian crisis, and the United States is trying to give more and more aid to Yemen, but again, the issue is, even though they know, as in the US military knows, the Houthis are the enemies, there's way too much probability for collateral damage. So the US military, again, is probably not going to do anything about it. Now, what would actually provoke the US military to at least retaliate? I mean, who knows? If the US military is actually getting rockets launched their way, possibly even drones on some other instances, the US military seems to have one of the highest tolerances I've ever seen in US military history. I think the effects of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, it has really changed the policy with how the US military wants to operate furthermore within the Middle East. But again, this is a situation where you have one faction, the Houthis, who they can make any threat they want, they can virtually almost do whatever attack they want, and the US military is pinned into a corner. They're not going to do anything about it because the US military can't do anything about it. They don't want to cause further harm or a bigger humanitarian crisis to the civilians of Yemen.